Hello, I'm Brad Sohns. 7 generations of my family have lived in Mound, Minnesota on Lake Minnetonka. It was a long and interesting journey from Baden, Germany to Mound for my pioneer family, starting in 1849. I will use my family to tell the story of immigration experienced by many pioneers who left Germany or the Scandinavian countries in the mid-1850s and settled in the newly opened territory west of the Mississippi River after arriving in the frontier town of St. Paul. I will introduce some of my 1800s relatives and their neighbors. Your own family's immigration story may have similarities to mine. I encourage you to do your own research. I will list some excellent resources at the end of this video. For me, it was like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle, one piece at a time. First, a brief introduction. 105 years after the first Sohns pioneer immigrated to America, I was born in Wayzata at the Minnetonka Hospital, which closed 59 years ago. It was co-founded by Dr. Mitchell of Mound. My wife Linda Morton and I both grew up in Mound and graduated from Mound Westtonka High School. We were married on the Lady of the Lake paddleboat in Excelsior. Our children, Brian and Melissa, graduated from Mound Westtonka High School. My careers included being a high school biology and math teacher, an information technology professional spanning 33 years, and a 4-year stint as the VP General Manager of a residential real estate company, wedged in there after 9/11. Linda was a 3rd grade teacher for 40 years, being recognized for her teaching skills and her dedication to her students' learning. I knew virtually nothing about my family before starting my research in the spring of 2021. Why would they leave Baden, Germany, travel across the Atlantic Ocean in often deplorable conditions, and move into the wilderness of Minnesota? They came from Hoffenheim, traveled to New York, then to St. Paul, then to Carver County, and finally to Lake Minnetonka. That was a fairly typical path for pioneers in this area in the mid-1800s. In April 2023, after 2 years and over 1,500 hours of research and writing, I completed a 23-chapter family history book and this video, which is based on part of the book. It is a story of immigration that I would never have imagined. It is also a story of how maiden names can get lost in history. 5 Sohn siblings immigrated to America. The only brother came in 1849. 3 sisters in 1853, and the 4th sister in 1860, my second great-grandmother Susanna. Using the term second great-grandmother is just an abbreviation for saying great-great. 4 of the Sohn siblings would head out to Carver County at the new settlements of Chaska and Carver, first arriving in 1853. Today, Baden-Württemberg is a state in the southwestern part of the country where Hoffenheim is located, just east of the Rhine River and relatively close to France. What was it like to raise a poor farm family in Germany? For many reasons, the survival rate of children living to adulthood was terrible. You can see the survival rate of 6 generations in my direct path. 2 of 6 of my 8th great-grandparents' children survived after being born in the 1640s. 5 of 10 of my 3rd great-grandparents' children survived after being born 200 years later. Just 21 of the 52 Sohns children in those 6 generations survived to adulthood. That's a 40% survival rate or 60% death rate. Most of the 31 died at birth. Some mothers died giving birth. In my family, if the children made it to age 3, they generally survived. Today's vaccinations have eliminated most of the childhood diseases that they died from at that time. My 3rd great-grandparents, Johann and Anna Maria, got married in April 1812 in Germany. As a point in history, that was 3 months before the War of 1812 started in America against Great Britain, at a time when there were only 18 states. Their surviving children, born between 1812 and 1837, were the 5 Sohn siblings who immigrated to America and the wilderness of Minnesota. The failure of the Revolution of 1848-1849 to establish democracy in Germany was the last straw for many Germans. thousands took a leap of faith that life in America would be a gamble worth taking. The only male sibling, Henry, came first in 1849, arriving in the frontier town of St. Paul on the Mississippi River, population 900. He was a young 25-year-old, checking it out for his four sisters back home in Hoffenheim. As points in history, 1849 was the year that Minnesota became a territory. It was part of the western frontier at that time as the expansion was happening from east to west. It was 9 years before Minnesota became a state in 1858, 12 years before the start of the Civil War in 1861, and 13 years before the brief U.S.-Dakota War in Minnesota in 1862. Henry was definitely a pioneer. The 1850s saw about 1 million Germans immigrate to America. 3 of Henry's 4 sisters followed in 1853. Catherine, Christina, and Anna Maria, or Mary, were my second great-grandaunts. St. Paul had grown to approximately 2,000 people. The sisters were 37, 21, and 16, with only Catherine being married. By 1860, about 1.3 million German-born immigrants were living in America. The 5th Sohns sibling, the last of the 4 sisters, Susanna, arrived in St. Paul before heading to Chaska. In 1860, St. Paul was described as a dirty town on the edge of the frontier, with plenty of saloons and brothels. Susanna was my 41-year-old second great-grandmother. It was the path from her that would eventually lead to Lake Minnetonka. German immigrants typically left from the ports of Bremen or Hamburg on packet ships that carried mail, cargo, and people. They were described as being crowded, dark, damp, unsanitary, and foul-smelling. Most passengers were in steerage, basically between deck or wherever a spot could be found. There was lots of illness, some deaths, and some violence being packed into such tight spaces. Susanna traveled on the Gerhard. The ship's manifest listed 198 passengers, 17 in first-class cabins, and 44 in second class. The other 137 passengers were between deck, as Susanna and her 3 children were, as passengers 99 through 102. You can see the documented path from Hoffenheim, New York, and St. Paul. A note was made that no deaths were noted on this voyage. After surviving their Atlantic voyage, they needed to get to St. Paul. Early trains were gradually finding their way westward towards the Mississippi River. Along with horses and wagons, they would make their way to a steamboat hub, such as the one at Galena, Illinois. From there it was upstream to St. Paul. Now to get to Chaska. First, Henry did what many pioneers did. He got married in St. Paul. Rarely would a man or woman head into the wilderness without a spouse to help them establish their farm and make a lot of babies, also known as future farmhands. The steamboat took them up the Mississippi. Seeing Fort Snelling, built in 1825, the steamboat would take a left up the Minnesota River. The Dakota thought that this juncture of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers was immediately over the center of the earth and beneath the center of heaven. Departing at Chaska, Henry and Teresa would become one of the first 9 pioneer families in Chaska. This may not be the exact steamboat that they arrived on, but it was one of 8 that made 49 trips to Carver County in 1853. 1854 was a more difficult year for steamboat traveling due to the low water levels on the Minnesota River. The Little Rapids made it especially difficult to get a steamboat south of Carver. Little Rapids later became the location where one of Henry's 4 sisters settled and farmed. The pioneers came to a deciduous forest called the Big Woods. Great efforts were required to build wagon trails through it, to clear the land for farming, and to build homes, typically log cabins. I took this picture on the appropriately named Big Woods Boulevard that leads into Chaska today. This Chaska history book states that Chaska was the first town in the county, and in the spring of 1853, the first German claims about Chaska village were made. Henry Sohns settled in the southwest of Section 7 in what became Chaska Township. I had to determine where Henry and Teresa settled and farmed. A lot has changed in the last 170 years. I found that this 1880 map was the best one to show where the pioneers had settled earlier in 1853 and 1854. None of the other property owners shown were there yet, or the nicely laid out settlements at Chaska or Carver, or the railroads. The 9 red-lettered properties were the original 9 pioneers who arrived in the spring of 1853. The next wave of 4 pioneers arrived the next year. Henry arrived in St. Paul in 1849. Why didn't he head into the wilderness until 1853, besides needing to find a wife first? Because he couldn't. The northern part of Minnesota was Chippewa country, the southern part was Dakota country. The treaties of Travis de Sioux and Mendota had to be signed and fully implemented before the pioneers could settle west of the Mississippi. The red oval shows where the Sohns pioneers settled. A typical pioneer's farm included a rough log cabin, a team of horses, a plow, a gun for hunting and protection, dawn to dusk work, and a lot of babies to raise. Finding Henry's quarter section through the dense forest must have been interesting. In anticipation of pioneers making claims in 1853, the Public Land Survey System was charged with sending out crews consisting of chain men, axe men, and compass men. 66-foot-long chains were most often used by the surveyors. A quarter section was 1/2 mile by 1/2 mile, or 40 chain lengths by 40 chain lengths. Section corners and quarter section corners were typically marked with wooden posts, sometimes also with rocks. They sometimes marked bearing trees near the posts. The surveyors were allowed to be off by 1 chain length, which was 66 feet or 22 yards per mile, leading to many future disputes over property lines. Remember that there were trees, hills, swamps, ponds, and lakes to contend with. Many contracted surveyors had little experience, and the results were very problematic. Alcohol abuse and a lack of professionalism were said to be typical problems. Henry and Teresa found their quarter section. Now it was my turn to find it 170 years later and walk the same land that they farmed. I was able to map their quarter section onto a current Google Earth image. I randomly circled 5 heavily wooded areas that exist today. Back then, the entire area would have been heavily wooded. I was able to find where the original horse and wagon trail was and mapped it to the Google Earth image. Purchased at $1.25 per acre, that 160 acres would have cost them $200, or in 2023 dollars, $7,771. If you are familiar with Chaska, you head up the hill towards Carver. When you hit the intersection of Highway 212 and Highway 61, or Chaska Boulevard, you're there. I walked the small farm that is there today and touched what was likely the fieldstone corner saved from the original barn. Like some early pioneers, Henry and Teresa wanted to explore more of the new country as it was expanding westward. They headed to Harrington, Kansas in a covered wagon in 1860 with their 4 children, just months before Kansas became a state. They had 4 more children before Teresa and son Louis died of malaria. I found the 1868 Sohns graveyard where Henry buried them. A brief story from 1868. Mrs. Sohns and her 5-year-old son Louis, died of malaria. Mr. Sohns dug the graves on the knoll and buried both. A buffalo broke the stone. After that, Mr. Sohns and the rest of the family moved to Junction City, Kansas. In 1934, a son came back, put the stone in a concrete foundation, and put a pipe fence up. Next time I'm in Kansas, I will definitely find that graveyard. Before I leave Kansas, I have to mention that my wife Linda was born at Fort Riley near Junction City when my father-in-law was stationed there. Back in 1876, not only was Henry Sohns living in Junction City, but also a historical figure named Colonel George Armstrong Custer. With relatively few people living there at that time, perhaps Henry and the Colonel greeted each other regularly on horseback before the Colonel's fateful trip to Montana and the Battle of Little Bighorn. That did not end well for him. Back at Carver County, the rest of the Sohns siblings were establishing themselves. When I showed this map previously, I had Joseph Veit's name underlined as one of the second wave of 4 pioneers, whose property was at the blue letter L. Who was he? He was the husband of Henry's sister Catherine and the brother-in-law of her 4 siblings. He was another second great-granduncle to me. Henry had, in fact, paved the way to America for his sisters. Brother Henry and sister Catherine were now neighbors. Family members often purchased property near each other in the wilderness so that they had neighbors that they could trust and that they could share farm work with. The Veits farmed their quarter section from 1854 until 1886, when Joseph became ill and passed away shortly after. Unlike her sisters, Catherine was already married with 1 child upon arrival in 1853, with her second being born in 1854. Meanwhile, at Lake Minnetonka in 1854, Matthias Cook and Frederick Jennings arrived in what is now Mound. Frank Halstead arrived in what is now Minnetrista in 1855. Nathaniel Harrison arrived in what is now 3 Points in Mound in 1856. If my Sohns relatives had come to Lake Minnetonka in 1853, instead of 14 miles south at Chaska, they could have had their choice of bays to name after themselves. Sohns Bay has a nice ring to it. Back at Carver County, roughly the same time that Colonel George Armstrong Custer's life was ending in Montana, tragedy struck the Veits farm during a German beer bash. As the Chaska newspaper reported, Joseph Bauer, who was a friend from Glencoe, had retired from the dancing room and regaling himself on lager, when with the expression upon his tongue that he would live while he did live, he sauntered into the ballroom and commenced dancing as well as a man could who was more than 3 sheets to the wind. The man was carried from the ballroom and, lingering but a few minutes, died. Will this or not serve as a warning to others who appear hopelessly fond of their toddies? We can place our finger upon several in this town who, unless they forbear, will soon be the victims of bad whiskey. I was determined to walk the land and search for any remnants of the Veit farm buildings, long removed. I spotted a fieldstone under brush and leaves. Cleaning it off, it was the corner of what was likely a small barn. Nearby was a pile of barn timbers from whenever the barn fell down or was torn down decades ago. I was also able to approximate the old horse and wagon trail and what would have been the Veits' driveway. I calculated where I thought the old farmhouse would have been and put an orange stake in the ground to take this picture on the bottom right. Then I realized that I was standing where a man had danced himself to death about 148 years ago. In 1856, the quarter section adjoining the Henry and Teresa Sohns farm and the Joseph and Catherine Veit farm was registered with Sister Christina Sohns and her husband Henry Gale, the second of the 3 Henrys mentioned in this story. It was a popular name. If you drive along Highway 212 in Chaska today, you are driving through what was Sohns country up until about 137 years ago, when it seems that none of those 3 Sohns pioneers were living and farming there. After immigrating with her 2 sisters in 1853, Christina had married Henry Gale in St. Paul, of course, in 1854. That began their interesting story from being poor farmers to prosperous farmers. Although a preemption land certificate was found for the northwest quarter section of Section 7, it is unclear if Henry and Christina actually lived there for any significant period of time, or if they let it go on a right of first refusal sometime later. In 1857, they were in St. Paul operating a vegetable stand. Henry was also a butcher. The 1860 census showed him being a farmer in Rose Township, think Roseville. Like Christina's brother Henry, they were restless pioneers. They headed to California in a covered wagon about 1862. 1 newborn died on the journey. After driving cattle apparently near San Francisco and possibly searching for gold, They arrived about 1865, allegedly with $4,000 worth of gold, equivalent to about $120,000 today. In 1867, they purchased property in San Francisco Township of Carver County. To summarize this point in time, in 1867, Henry Sohns was 7 years in Kansas with his family, Sister Catherine was still on her Chaska Township property, and Sister Christina had purchased property about 3.5 miles south on the Minnesota River in San Francisco Township of Carver County. That property had been platted originally as being the Carver County seat. After it flooded, they abandoned that idea and made Chaska the county seat. The little rapids, marked by sandstone shelves, made it impossible for steamboats to travel beyond that point during the frequent periods of low water. This shows Henry and Christina Gale, along with 6 of their 9 children who survived to adulthood. They had a total of 14 children. One of the 9 was killed later when his horse and wagon was hit by a train. The original home experienced a fire. Their second home, built of Carver brick, was apparently built on the same foundation as the original home, considering the shape of each home's footprint. The 1887 home still exists in 2023 and sits about 30 feet from the Minnesota riverbank. The Gales were very successful farmers, worked hard, and became wealthy. Their livestock included ducks, turkeys, and cattle, which supplied their butcher shops in Chaska, Carver, and later Excelsior. One son, Charles, started the butcher shop in Chaska at age 14 and served as the butcher for 60 years. The brick home was a sign of prosperity in 1887 with its size and fancy brick arches over the windows. Another sign of prosperity was a little building on the river's edge, shown in the lower right. It was also made of brick and included 2 small windows with fancy arches. It was a brick outhouse. Their relatives were living downstream from that outhouse, which still sits right on the riverbank. This picture, taken in May 2022, shows the fieldstone foundation of the original barn, with the home behind it. I so badly wanted to climb over that barbed wire-topped fence and get into the home that 5 generations of my extended Sohns family had lived in, or visited from just downstream in Chaska Township. This home has been on the list of 10 most endangered historic sites in Minnesota. After being passed on to children, grandchildren, and a great-grandchild of Christina, the 9th owner of the property became the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They built the Rapids Lake Education and Visitor Center right up the hill from the old farmhouse. The property is known as the Gale Middlestad Farm to many, but to me it's the Sohns Gale Middlestad Farm. Without Henry meeting and marrying Christina Sohns in St. Paul and heading to Carver County, where 2 of Christina's siblings were already farming, his life's journey may have been very different. Mary Sohns was Henry, Catherine, and Christina's youngest sister, who married Christian Flager in St. Paul, of course, in 1856, 3 years after immigrating with her sisters. The newlyweds headed to the wilderness at Hastings, also on the west side of the Mississippi River. At that point in history, in 1856, 3 Sohns siblings had properties in Carver County and 1 in Dakota County. All 4 were married and making lots of babies, almost 40 between the 4 of them. The siblings could visit each other by using the steamboat service running on the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, or by horse and wagon. My second great-grandmother, Susanna, had a difficult life in Germany. She was the 4th and final Sohns sister to immigrate. She arrived in 1860. The path from her leads to Lake Minnetonka and me. The 1880 census indicated with a bolded D in quotation marks, as if to shame her, that she was divorced. Her 1899 funeral service record states that her married life was blessed with 4 children. Being married, divorced, and reverting to her maiden name of Sohns in 1850s Germany would have been extremely rare and would have required extraordinary circumstances. I seriously question that possibility. As shown earlier, Susanna had arrived on the Gerhardt steamboat on May 31, 1860, with 3 children, including my great-grandfather Henry, not to be confused with Susanna's brother Henry or her brother-in-law Henry, both of whom I already talked about. Unable to leave the mystery of Susanna's life alone, I hired a genealogy researcher in Germany with a very similar last name as mine to do some digging, for good or bad. He found birth and baptismal information for all of her children, including birth dates, baptism dates and witnesses, and godparents' names. She actually had 5 children, not 4. Katerina died shortly after birth, and second-born Johann, who was 16 at the time, did not immigrate with his mother and 3 siblings. Susanna was never married, and all 5 children were documented as illegitimate, the term of that day. There were no fathers on the birth records, unlike every other birth record that I was able to find going much further back. According to Martin, that information points to a bad situation for Susanna based on his experience researching that time period in his home country of Germany. Cruel landlords of tenant farmers would sometimes treat poor young farm women terribly. I was warned when I started my research that it would not be unusual if I discovered some things about my family that would be surprising or shocking. Every family has them. Martin thought it possible that some or all of Susanna's children were the result of rape, at least the first 2 or 3. There is no way to know for sure or to know why her sisters were spared that situation. Sometimes children got separated and worked on different farms for different reasons. If my great-grandfather Henry had been given his father's last name, instead of being given his mother's name of Sohns, I would not be a Sohns. In fact, most of the hundreds of Sohns in Minnesota, particularly those in the counties of Carver, Dakota, Ramsey, and Hennepin, including the Lake Minnetonka area, and other parts around the country, would not have the last name of Sohns. That will make additional sense later. After living for 10 years in the village of Chaska, Susanna was able to purchase 11 acres of the circled 24-acre plot in 1870 on the southeast corner of her older sister Catherine's quarter section. It was unusual for a woman at that time to have property in her name, although that was starting to change. The 5 Sohns pioneer siblings are long departed, but left their mark on the pioneer history of Carver County. Henry is buried in Kansas, Catherine in Chaska, Christina in Carver, Mary in Hastings, and my second great-grandmother Susanna in Victoria. I discovered that she is the only person in the Lake Auburn Moravian Cemetery without a grave marker. Perhaps that was because it was scandalous in 1899 to have never been married but have 5 children. At the time of this video, I am having a grave marker designed. Susanna will finally have one after 124 years. In 1871, a year and a half after his mother Susanna had purchased her 11-acre farm, her son Henry purchased her 11 acres plus an adjoining 13 acres. He was 23 years old, farming with his 13-year-old brother Charles. Typical of the time, the 1880 census showed Henry's occupation as farmer. Charles has no occupation because he was under age 14, and his mother Susanna as keeping house. 20-year-old brother Philip was likely still living in Hastings with his Aunt Mary. 47 years after buying that farm, Henry would find his way to Lake Minnetonka, with a couple of stops in between. A huge event in that same year of 1871 was the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railway arriving in Chaska. Settlers would no longer be dependent on the steamboats and the fluctuating water levels of the Minnesota River for travel. The smell of those early locomotives may have been an occasional issue for the uphill farming Sohns. On October 3, 1880, my 32-year-old great-grandfather Henry, the future Lake Minnetonka resident, married my 15-year-old great-grandmother Bertha Ott. No comment on that. This was their 1880 wedding photo and their wedding announcement in the Chaska newspaper. The first of their 14 children were born on that farm before they sold it and moved to the village of Chaska in 1883, where they had their next 2 children. Bertha would give birth to children between the ages of 15 and 44. An April 1883 newspaper article showed that they purchased the lot and home at the corner of Walnut and 3rd Street for $800, circled in red, which is the current site of Clearsoft Water Conditioning. This is across the street from the lime green outline Chaska City Square. Their property was north of the old Chaska House Hotel, circled in blue. The yellow arrow points to the approximate location of an old steamboat landing site that Henry, his brothers, and mother likely arrived at 23 years earlier. Taking another shot at farming, on February 27, 1886, Henry and Bertha purchased a 70-acre farm in Laketown Township, minus the 4.13 acres that the Great Northern Railroad purchased on the same day to build a railroad line through the Sohns farm property. For the locals, this will help you orient yourself. St. Bonifacius is on the west, spelled incorrectly. The Moss's train station in 1898 is at the current Kings Point Road roundabout at Minnesota Highway 7. Moss is another Mound name. The old horse and wagon trail running south from the train station later became Victoria Drive. The horse and wagon trail at the bottom later became Minnesota Highway 5. Breathhorse is another Mound name. I'm also foreshadowing. Everything to the right of the yellow line is now Carver Park Reserve. The farm buildings associated with those little black dots are long gone, other than a few pieces of some original fieldstone foundations. Here's a clean view of the park reserve. The Lowry Nature Center driveway takes you right into their building into the nature trails. If you've walked the Tamarack Trail, you are right in the middle of Henry and Bertha's second farm. Exploring the 70 acres, I came across what appears to be an untouched Indian mound. I also found 4 artifacts near the old farmhouse location that would have belonged to the members of my family. I found 2 medicine bottles, the one on the right seeming to be from around 1890. 2 of their first 3 children born on that farm died of diphtheria at about that time. The top third of the milk can that I pounded out and painted had a label of their neighbors, the Clatts, who likely traded milk for products that the Sohns had more than they needed. The part of the stoneware jug that was underground had completely disintegrated. The Nature Center has the artifacts now. Using this 2022 picture, I mapped the location of their old farmhouse, the horse and wagon trail to the farmhouse, the 2 main areas of tillable farmland, and of course the old Great Northern Railroad line, which was abandoned in 1900. That part of the line was no longer necessary due to the new Great Northern Railroad line extending from Wayzata to Hutchinson, passing through Lake Minnetonka, Mound, St. Bonifacius, Waconia, and other cities. The railroad transacted their 4.13 acres back to Henry and Bertha in 1900. Unknown to me at the time I was walking through prickly vegetation to discover it, there was a plan to turn the old railroad line into a bike trail less than a year later. I have now biked through the old Sohns farm property. I mapped all the 1880s German and Scandinavian farms, the latter being mostly Swedish, onto a current Google Earth snapshot. Since Henry's wife was an Ott, here's that brief story. Frederick Ott married Wilhelmine Minnie Seaman in Germany in 1858. They immigrated in 1866 and had 4 children, including Bertha, who was born in 1865. In 1869, Frederick died in a logging accident in the Big Woods on the west end of Henderson, which is also on the Minnesota River. Frederick and Minnie Ott were therefore another set of my second great-grandparents. Being a 29-year-old widow living in the wilderness with 4 children would make life very difficult. 2 years later, in 1871, Minnie Ott married her second husband, George Breathhorse. Remember that earlier foreshadowing? In March 1871, 3 months before he married Minnie Ott, George had traded farm properties with August Pofel in Laketown Township. George would no longer be farming at what is now Crown College. When I attend Crown College basketball games today, the players are running back and forth on the same land that a single George Breathhorse ran his horse and oxen back and forth on while plowing from 1866 to March 1871, when he married my second great-grandmother. The 4 Ott children were soon joined by 5 Breathorst half-siblings, all boys. At the time of the land swap, little Bertha Ott was 6 years old. 9 years later, she married Henry. An unbelievable stroke of luck regarding the history of my Sohns, Ott, and Breathorst relatives was that a Swede, Andrew Peterson, wrote a daily diary during his time in Laketown Township from 1855 to his death in 1898. Some of my relatives are included in his diary entries. Andrew started the Scandinavian Baptist Church in his log cabin before the church and cemetery were built where the current Island View Golf Course is, overlooking Lake Waconia. The cemetery is still located between the clubhouse and the driving range. On April 18, 1888, Andrew writes, "Sen, who was actually Henry Sohns, came after 20 bushels seed wheat today." 4 days later, on April 22, 1888, he writes, "In the afternoon we buried Bradhouse," who was actually George Breathorst, out by the Moravian Church. Multiple books have been written and movies have been made using Andrew's diaries depicting Swedish pioneer life in America, which includes living amongst German pioneers. Andrew is standing in front of one of the original farm buildings that he would have built sometime after his arrival in 1855. On the right are the remains of their Lunston neighbor's original barn's fieldstone foundation. Below that is a picture of what became Lunston Lumber Company in Mayer, Minnesota. There's Andrew standing on his farm in 1885. The property is located at the intersection of Minnesota Highway 5 and Parley Lake Road, between Waconia and Victoria. That's me in April 2023, standing at roughly the same angle as Andrew, but a little closer due to a fence and some animals behind my wife, the photographer. Josephine Mihalich's 1984 written book, Andrew Peterson and the Scandia Story, includes a chapter entitled Neighbors that provides some additional information that Josephine found regarding my Sohns, Ott, and Breathorst pioneer relatives. There is a considerable amount of information regarding my second great-grandmother, Minnie Ott Breathorst. 3 generations of my family would almost certainly have visited the Peterson farm in the 1800s and early 1900s. A 4th, me, toured the property in 2021 with a group of engineers who were working with the Carver County Historical Society to assess a restoration effort of the property to the year 1885. Funding has been raised. This property has also been on a list of 10 most endangered historic sites in Minnesota. In 1918, 58 years after he immigrated with his mother Susanna and 2 younger brothers, Henry Sohns was now 70 years old. His wife Bertha Ott was now 53. They were done with farming. Although the farm ownership would stay with some of their 14 children until 1940, they moved to Mound on Lake Minnetonka. As the crow flies, the nearest part of Lake Minnetonka was less than 3 miles from their farm. It is likely that they had visited the lake numerous times over the years. They probably knew their nearby neighbor of 15 years, Major George Halstead. He and his brother, Captain Frank, were known as the Hermits of Lake Minnetonka and were the namesakes of Halstead's Bay. Henry and Bertha's Mound home was on Commerce Boulevard, or County Road 110, right across the street from the current Our Lady of the Lake playground. The building has been the location of numerous businesses, probably best known as the former location of Peterson and Peterson Eye Clinic. The existing home to the north was built about 1908. The middle picture of Henry and Bertha's home was provided by George Buell, whose wife's grandmother purchased the home after my great-grandparents had passed away in 1929 and 1930, respectively. So that is not Bertha. The final picture shows an auxiliary building on the right overlooking Lost Lake. About 4 months before they moved to Mound, the Germany-born Henry and Bertha sent their son Louis, my grandfather, off to France to fight the Germans during the First World War. How did the government thank them? By putting Henry's name on an enemy aliens list. Bertha was on a separate list without the word enemy. They were guilty of being German-speaking Americans. I've added this slide as a tribute to local historian Tom Rockvam. Walking past my great-grandparents' home many times during the summer months, as they were living with their uncles less than 200 yards away, would have been these three little girls on the right bottom corner. There is no truth to the rumor, started by me, that my great-grandparents would yell, "Hey you girls, get off our lawn." Those little girls swam a lot in Cook's Bay and apparently became very good at washing cars as they got older. They were even better at being international singing stars in the late 1930s through World War II and beyond. As Tom was fond of reminding people, the Andrews sisters had more top 10 hits than Elvis or the Beatles. Tom became friends with Patty Andrews. Some of my great-grandparents' 14 children, including those highlighted in green or yellow, lived in that Mound home at some time. Son George had married his farm neighbor Carrie Moss and lived in Victoria. Daughter Rosie married Peter Englehart and lived in Mound. Daughter Minnie married Bernard Weiland and lived in Mound. Henry and Bertha's descendants account for almost all of the Sohns in this area of Minnesota and beyond. I have 132 Sohns included in my book's index. As stated earlier, if Henry's mother Susanna had given her son Henry his father's last name in Germany, none of us would be Sohns. Almost all of the Sohns in Minnesota were descendants of Henry and Bertha's 14 children. Before we leave the pioneers behind, a visit to the Lake Auburn Moravian Cemetery in Victoria would include seeing the graves of my second great-grandmother Susanna, her son, my great-grandfather Henry Sohns, his wife, my great-grandmother Bertha Ott, her mother Minnie Seaman Ott Brethorst, my second great-grandmother, and her second husband George Brethorst. The word pioneer was included in the obituaries of Susanna, Minnie, and George. Henry and Bertha would have been considered early settlers as the next generation. Back at Mound, most of my grandparents' married life, shown on the left side of this slide, my father's childhood and his married life, shown on the right side of this slide, as well as my own childhood with my siblings, shown on the lower right side of this slide, and a few years of my married life to Linda Morton, were lived in this triangle in Mound. Downtown was on the west, the Tonka Toys building was on the south, and Harrison's Bay was to the northeast and east. My grandparents' home was located about 3 blocks to the west of my parents' home. Only a few of the family names from my childhood remained in that triangular neighborhood. Most were customers on my Star Tribune paper route. They were World War II parents raising a bunch of baby boomer children. Nobody had much money, but we did have a lot of fun in the neighborhood and enjoyed all that Lake Minnetonka had to offer. Life gradually improved for the generations of my Sohns family after my second great-granduncle Henry and his 4 sisters took a chance on America and living in the wilderness. At one time or another since 1918, 3 generations of the family have lived at the Blue Dot location on Commerce Boulevard, 4 at the Yellow Dot on Belmont Lane, 4 in the vicinity of the Orange Dot on Noble Lane, and 2 each at the Purple Dot on Southview Lane and the Red Dot on Jennings Cove Road, the latter being just north of Mound in Minnetonka. This video included just part of the 23-chapter story told in my unpublished book. Hard copies are available for reading or reference at the locations shown. Additional hard copies are available upon request for the cost of printing. Digital copies are available for any member of the extended Sohns family for their use. It is very likely that the first 20 chapters would be their same history with only slight modifications needed, then the last 3 chapters swapped out. If this story of immigration has motivated you to research and document your own family history, the information on this slide may help you. If I can help answer any questions regarding resources or the process, please feel free to contact me through the West Tonka Historical Society or through Facebook.